Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. James Carter never sought conflict. He bought his home for peace, for independence. But when the HOA, led by the ruthless Karen Monroe, set its sights on him, peace became war. What started with underground pipes turned into a battle of power, control, and revenge. And James, he was ready to fight back. James Carter had never been the type to get involved in neighborhood drama. He had bought his house on the outskirts of a suburban development, specifically because it sat just outside the jurisdiction of the local HOA. It was a quiet place, well-maintained, with enough land to make it feel private but not isolated. He had spent years improving it, adding modern conveniences, investing in a smart home system, and most recently, installing a new underground piping system for water and gas. The project had cost him $20,000, but it was worth every penny. He had ensured that his house would be self-sufficient, independent from the outdated and overpriced services controlled by the HOA. Unfortunately, that same HOA had made it their mission to meddle in his affairs. More specifically, Karen Monroe, the HOA president, had taken a personal interest in his property the moment she noticed the construction work. She was a woman in her 50s, always immaculately dressed in pastel-colored suits, her demeanor carrying the entitled air of someone who had ruled the community for far too long. She had a way of making the most absurd demands sound official, often wielding her authority like a weapon. James first encountered her disapproval when he caught her standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching the workers install the new pipes. At first, he ignored her, assuming she was just being nosy. But when she finally approached him, clipboard in hand, he knew trouble was brewing. "You can't install these pipes," she declared, her tone carrying an air of absolute authority. James raised an eyebrow, wiping sweat from his brow. "Excuse me? These pipes, whatever they are not permitted in this community." She tapped her clipboard as if it held some sacred rulebook. "The HOA has strict guidelines about infrastructure modifications." James let out a small chuckle. "That's interesting, considering I'm not part of the HOA." Karen's lips thinned. "You live in the community. Your home is visible from the road, which means it affects property values. And the HOA has the right to maintain the aesthetics and overall quality of this neighborhood." James folded his arms. "I paid for these pipes. I have the permits. Everything is legal. You don't have jurisdiction over my property." Karen smiled, but it was the kind of smile a person gives when they already think they've won. "We'll see about that." The conversation ended, but James had a feeling this wasn't over. That evening, as he reviewed his paperwork one more time to reassure himself that everything was in order, a formal notice was slipped under his front door. It was from the HOA, stating that the underground pipes were considered an unauthorized modification and would be forcibly removed in 3 days unless James complied with their demands. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He had expected some level of pushback, but this was beyond ridiculous. The HOA had no legal grounds to enforce such a demand, yet Karen was treating it as if it were law. James wasn't one to back down easily. He had dealt with bureaucratic nonsense before, and he knew exactly how to handle it. First, he installed security cameras at key points around his property. He wanted a clear view of anyone who tried to trespass. Then, he put up multiple signs, warning that the land was private property and that unauthorized entry would be considered trespassing. But most importantly, he had one final precaution in mind, something Karen and her enforcers wouldn't expect. Later that evening, just as he was finishing his preparations, another envelope was delivered. This time, it was an official notice from the HOA, confirming that the demolition would begin at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning. James smirked to himself. Good luck with that. He turned off the porch light and locked his doors. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were about to get one. At exactly 8:45 a.m., James was already awake, sipping his morning coffee as he watched the HOA's crew gather outside his property. His cameras had caught them arriving in waves, several workers in reflective vests, an excavator idling on the street, and, of course, Karen herself standing at the front like a general preparing for battle. She wore a smug expression, clipboard in hand, occasionally barking orders to the workers who were rolling out their tools and preparing to dig up the pipes that she had deemed unacceptable. James had expected some pushback, but this was almost theatrical. The level of arrogance was astounding. Karen actually thought she could bring a demolition crew onto private property and rip apart $20,000 worth of infrastructure like it was some abandoned lot. The first problem for the HOA appeared almost immediately. The entrance to James's property was blocked by a large locked steel gate. Karen had always insisted that homeowners keep their gates open for community cohesion and emergency accessibility, but James, not being a member of the HOA, had no such obligation. And now his reinforced gate stood firmly closed, cutting off their access. Karen's face darkened as she stormed up to the gate and rattled it. She turned toward James's house and shouted toward his windows, "James, open this gate immediately. You are obstructing official HOA operations, and that is a direct violation of the bylaws." Inside, James leaned against the counter, amused. She really thought screaming at his house was going to get her what she wanted. He took another sip of coffee, enjoying the show. When no response came, Karen grew impatient. She raised a thick stack of papers and waved them dramatically in the air. "I have the official authorization right here. The HOA has voted on this, and we have full approval to proceed with the removal of those unauthorized pipes. You have exactly 2 minutes to comply before we take action." James raised an eyebrow as he watched the scene unfold on his security feed. The workers hesitated, clearly unsure whether they should wait or follow orders. One of them muttered something to Karen, but she waved him off, her confidence unwavering. James knew exactly what she was holding, a bogus HOA-approved document, something that had no actual legal standing. HOA rules only applied to members of the HOA, which he was not. And more importantly, actual property laws trumped HOA bylaws any day of the week. But Karen wasn't interested in legalities. She was interested in power. After 2 minutes of silence from James, Karen snapped. "Fine," she hissed. "Tear it down." The workers exchanged uncertain glances, but when Karen barked the order again, one of them reluctantly climbed into the excavator. The engine roared to life, and with a lurch, the machine began moving forward, heading straight for the locked gate. James calmly reached for his phone. The moment the excavator's metal arm breached his property line and crashed through the steel gate, all hell broke loose. A piercing security alarm blared to life, an ear-splitting siren that echoed through the entire neighborhood. Simultaneously, powerful floodlights activated, bathing the scene in harsh white light, even though it was broad daylight. The workers froze in confusion, startled by the sudden chaos. Karen stumbled backward, her face contorted in shock. She hadn't expected a full security response. And then, to make matters worse, for her at least, the blaring sirens were soon accompanied by the wailing of police sirens. Within seconds, 2 patrol cars screeched to a halt in front of James's house. 4 uniformed officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts as they took in the scene. A demolished gate, a running excavator, and a group of HOA members looking like caught criminals. James finally stepped outside, taking his time, his posture relaxed. He pointed directly at Karen. "She's the one in charge," he said simply. "They broke onto my property and destroyed my gate." Karen's face paled. She hurried toward the officers, still clutching her stack of papers. "This is all a misunderstanding. I have approval from the HOA to conduct these removals." She shoved the documents toward one of the officers, her voice filled with exaggerated confidence. The cop took the papers and skimmed through them before glancing up. "This is an HOA order," he said flatly. "HOA rules don't override private property laws. Is this man—" He nodded toward James. "A signed member of your association?" Karen froze. She hesitated for just a second, just long enough for the officers to notice. "Well, he lives in the community," she tried. "And that means he must abide by our—" "No, it doesn't," the officer cut her off. "Living next to an HOA does not automatically make someone a member. If he's not signed into the HOA contractually, your rules do not apply to him." Karen opened and closed her mouth like a fish, completely thrown off. Before she could recover, James pulled out his own documents, official property permits, signed approvals, and the legal confirmation that he had every right to install his underground pipes. The officer barely skimmed it before nodding. "Looks like everything he's done is legal." The workers, sensing where this was going, quietly stepped away from the excavator. Karen, now desperate, tried a new tactic. "You don't understand, officer. These pipes, these modifications affect the whole neighborhood. I was acting in the best interest of the community." The officer gave her an unimpressed look. "Ma'am, breaking and entering is not acting in the best interest of the community. Right now, You and your workers are trespassing on private property, and based on what I'm seeing, you've also committed property damage." Karen's face drained of all color. James folded his arms, watching the slow, delicious realization sink in. She had overplayed her hand. "Well, officer," James said, his voice calm, "I'd like to file a formal complaint and a police report, and, depending on what my lawyer says, possibly press charges for destruction of property." Karen gasped audibly. The officer nodded. "Understood. We're going to need everyone to stay put while we sort this out." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but James wasn't done. He took one step forward, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Karen's breath hitched. For the first time since this whole debacle started, she looked genuinely afraid. James had won this round, but he knew Karen wasn't the type to back down easily, and that made things far from over. The scene outside James's house was frozen in tension. The workers had stopped moving. The excavator idled with its claw still hanging over the destroyed gate, and Karen stood stiff, her fingers tightening around her useless stack of papers. The police officers were already calling in additional reports, documenting the damage that had just been done to James's property. Karen, still reeling from how quickly the situation had turned against her, made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This isn't right," she exclaimed, her voice shrill as she turned back to the officers. "I was only enforcing HOA regulations. You can't just ignore community rules." One of the officers, a stern-looking man with a name tag that read Officer Reynolds, flipped his notepad shut and gave her an unimpressed look. "Ma'am, I'm going to repeat myself one last time," he said, his voice firm. "HOA rules do not override state property laws. This man is not a member of your association. You had no legal authority to send a work crew onto his land, and you certainly had no right to destroy his gate." Karen sputtered, her carefully crafted facade of control slipping further. But I had approval. The board voted. This was necessary." Officer Reynolds sighed. "And the board's approval means nothing when it concerns private property outside your jurisdiction." He turned toward the workers, who were looking anywhere but at Karen. "Which one of you was operating the excavator?" A middle-aged man in a construction vest hesitantly raised his hand. Me, sir." "Did you receive direct orders from this woman to break through the gate?" The man swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, she told me to just go through it." Karen whirled toward him in shock, betrayal flashing across her face. "You can't just—" The officer held up a hand, cutting her off. "That's all I needed to hear." He then turned to James. "Would you like to proceed with pressing charges?" James didn't hesitate. "Yes, absolutely." Karen's face drained of color. "Wait! No, you can't do this." But it was too late. One of the officers moved behind her, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for trespassing and destruction of private property. You have the right to remain silent." The moment the cuffs clicked around her wrists, Karen completely lost it. "You can't do this to me. I was acting for the good of the community. I was protecting the neighborhood from his awful modifications." She struggled against the officer's grip, but it was useless. "I have rights. I'm the president of the HOA. You can't just arrest me." James crossed his arms, watching her unravel. "You really thought you were untouchable, didn't you?" Karen turned toward him with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over, James. I will fight this. You will regret this." James shrugged. "I doubt it." The officers led her toward the squad car, placing her inside as she continued ranting, her voice muffled behind the car's closed door. Meanwhile, Officer Reynolds returned to James. "We'll process her at the station. As for your complaint, we'll need you to provide a full statement, and you might need to appear in court. But based on what I've seen, this is a solid case." James nodded. "Not a problem." Before the police left, James made sure to submit a formal request to the HOA board. With Karen in custody, the association would be forced to deal with her misconduct, and James wasn't just going to settle for charges, he wanted her removed from power entirely. The courtroom was filled with HOA members, residents, and even a few of Karen's most devoted followers. But the moment she entered, now in professional yet noticeably subdued attire, her confidence visibly shaken, the energy in the room shifted. James sat calmly at the plaintiff's table, his lawyer beside him. Across from him, Karen was trying to put on a dignified front, but there was no hiding the stress in her expression. The trial was swift and damning. The evidence was irrefutable. Security footage showed Karen ordering the demolition. Police reports documented the trespassing and property damage. James's legal permits proved his modifications were fully authorized. Karen's lawyer tried to spin the case, arguing that she was merely following HOA protocol and had no malicious intent. But it was clear to everyone, including the judge, that she had gone far beyond her authority. After reviewing the evidence, the judge ruled against Karen. She was ordered to personally compensate James for the full cost of his destroyed gate and security system. She was forced to resign as HOA president immediately. The judge issued a permanent restraining order preventing her from interfering with James's property again. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and James could see HOA members whispering amongst themselves, some relieved, others uncomfortable. They had spent years under Karen's rule, and now it was finally over. James leaned back in his chair, satisfied. Justice had been served, or so he thought, because Karen wasn't done yet. The verdict had been delivered. Karen Monroe, once the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, had been removed from her position, fined, and legally forbidden from interfering with James or his property ever again. As she left the courtroom, her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line, and for the first time in years, she had nothing to say. The HOA board wasted no time in holding an emergency meeting to replace her. Without her iron grip, members who had previously feared speaking up finally voiced their frustrations. Many admitted they had been bullied into compliance for years, fined for the most absurd infractions, and pressured into silence whenever they questioned her authority. The vote was swift. Karen was permanently banned from holding any HOA office. James had won. In the following days, he oversaw the repair of his gate, now reinforced with a stronger steel frame and an updated security system. He no longer had to worry about Karen or her enforcers storming onto his land again. The HOA, now under new leadership, formally apologized to him, though James made it clear he still wanted nothing to do with them. But Karen wasn't one to accept defeat so easily. It was nearly midnight when James heard a knock at his door. His security system had already alerted him to movement outside, so when he checked the camera feed, he wasn't surprised to see Karen standing on his porch, but she wasn't alone. Her husband, a broad-shouldered man named Richard, stood beside her. Unlike Karen, who looked distraught, Richard looked furious. His jaw was clenched, his fists were tight at his sides, and his posture radiated barely restrained aggression. James didn't open the door immediately. Instead, he turned on the porch light and spoke through the intercom. "It's late. What do you want?" Karen let out a shaky breath, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "James, please, just talk to us." James frowned but stepped outside, keeping a safe distance. The moment he did, Richard stepped forward aggressively. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Richard growled. "You humiliated my wife. You ruined her life. For what? A damn pipe?" James didn't flinch. "No, Richard, your wife ruined her own life. I just made sure she faced the consequences." Karen let out a choked sob, covering her face. "I lost everything," she whispered. "The HOA, my reputation. Do you have any idea what this has done to me?" James folded his arms. "You destroyed my property and tried to ruin my home. You expected no consequences." Richard stepped even closer, now directly in James's face. "You could have let it go. But no, you had to push it. You had to make a big deal out of it." His voice lowered, filled with quiet menace. "You think this is over?" James's eyes narrowed. He could see where this was heading. Richard wasn't here for an apology. He was here for revenge. "You're making a mistake," James warned. Richard smirked. "Number you did." And then he swung. James had anticipated hostility from Richard, but he hadn't expected the man to swing so fast. The punch came straight for his jaw, but James had spent enough years keeping himself in shape, not just for health, but for moments like this. He dodged, stepping back just in time for Richard's fist to slice through empty air, throwing him off balance. The next moment, James countered. His own fist connected cleanly with Richard's ribs, sending the larger man stumbling backward with a pained grunt. Karen let out a gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as her husband staggered, but didn't fall. He recovered quickly, eyes now burning with fury. "You son of a—" Richard lunged again, this time with more aggression. James was ready. He ducked under the next wild punch, then brought his elbow up hard into Richard's stomach. The man choked on his own breath, doubling over for just a second, long enough for James to land a clean, controlled strike against his jaw. This time, Richard went down hard, landing on the porch with a heavy thud. James took a step back, keeping his hands loose and ready. He wasn't the kind of man to instigate fights, but he sure as hell wasn't going to let someone threaten his home and get away with it. Karen screamed, dropping to her knees beside her husband. "Richard! Oh my God!" Richard groaned, blinking rapidly as he tried to sit up, but the fight was already over. He had lost. That's when James's front door swung open. His wife Emily stepped out, phone already in hand. "The police are on their way," she said firmly, her voice cold as she eyed Karen. "You should probably stay where you are." Karen's head snapped up, tears streaming down her face, but James knew that wasn't all grief. Some of it was pure rage. She had never been the type to accept losing. "This isn't fair," she sobbed. You took everything from me." James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Karen, you did that to yourself." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, blue and red lights flashing across the quiet street. Within moments, a police car rolled to a stop and 2 officers stepped out. One of them, Officer Reynolds, the same cop from the HOA debacle, looked at the scene with obvious frustration. He sighed. "I had a feeling we'd be back here." Emily crossed her arms. "Richard just attacked my husband." Reynolds' partner immediately stepped forward, pulling out handcuffs. "Sir, stand up slowly," he ordered Richard, who was still dazed from the blows he had taken. Richard muttered a curse, but obeyed. He wasn't in any condition to fight back this time. As the officers secured him, Karen grabbed at Reynolds' arm, desperate. "No, please. He was just trying to talk to James. This was all a misunderstanding." Reynolds shrugged her off. "Breaking and entering in the middle of the night? Assault? Yeah, I don't think so." Karen's face twisted with desperation, her emotions spilling out unchecked. "You don't understand. He ruined my life. He took everything from me. How am I supposed to fix this?" James looked at her with something close to pity, but not quite. "You can start by taking responsibility for your own actions." Karen let out a frustrated, broken sob, but it didn't matter anymore. As Richard was led toward the squad car, the officer informed him of his charges: assault, attempted trespassing, and violation of a court order prohibiting contact with James's household. Given his prior involvement with Karen's case, the judge was unlikely to be lenient. James turned toward Karen one last time. "I'd suggest you move on, Karen. This is over." Karen didn't answer. She simply watched in stunned silence as the car carrying her husband pulled away, leaving her standing alone in the street. She had lost, and this time, there was no coming back from it. A few weeks had passed since the final confrontation, and the neighborhood had never felt lighter. Without Karen's iron grip controlling everything, the HOA had begun to transform. The new leadership, comprised of homeowners who had long resented her rule, quickly dismantled many of her oppressive policies. People stopped living in fear of receiving ridiculous fines for minor infractions, and for the first time in years, the community actually felt like a place people wanted to live in. As for Karen, she disappeared. After Richard's arrest, she had tried to plead with the new HOA board to reinstate her, but they refused outright. She was now nothing more than a regular homeowner, stripped of her authority. Without her position of power, she found herself isolated, no longer feared or respected. Then, one morning, James woke up to the sight of a moving truck parked in front of Karen's house. By the afternoon, she was gone. No one knew where she had gone, and frankly, no one cared. James stood on his porch that evening, watching the sunset over his peaceful neighborhood, reflecting on everything that had happened. His gate was repaired, his security system upgraded, and most importantly, he had his peace back. The pipes, the very thing that had started it all, remained untouched, fully operational, just as they were meant to be. As for Richard, he had been given a conditional sentence, a large fine, a restraining order preventing him from approaching James's home, and a permanent criminal record. Emily joined James outside, handing him a cold drink. She leaned against him, watching the sky turn shades of orange and pink. "It's finally over," she murmured. James nodded, exhaling slowly. "Yeah, it is." For the first time in months, there were no more threats, no more HOA nonsense, no more battles to fight. Just a quiet, comfortable home, exactly as it should be. And as night fell over the neighborhood, James felt something he hadn't in a long time: absolute freedom.